And former U.S. President Barack Obama's CIA Director and Defense Secretary Leon Panetta has said China should play a more constructive role in dealing with North Korea after North Korean state media announced on Sunday its latest rocket engine test. Pyongyang said the test will help North Korea achieve world-class satellite launch capability, indicating a new type of rocket engine that could be compatible with an ICBM, that is Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. During an interview at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, Panetta was cautious about saying what role the U.S. should play in dealing with North Korea. Leon Panetta there, of course, the former CIA director, and we are discussing these issues here, taking a raft of other issues in the world in terms of security. Today is Wednesday when we talk about security. And let's hear from Professor Noah Midamba, especially, well, let's begin actually with Dr. Mustafa and with the issue of the migrants as well and Libya. And of course, we have this particular picture, a very telling picture on our touchscreen. And you can see this is what the migrants are doing. This was one person who was being rescued, at least this was March the 21st. And many of them have died crossing over so far. But we've not really come with an ultimate solution. So right now we understand that Libyans also, they're deporting 173 African migrants back.
The bigger picture here, and you're right here, there isn't any solution inside. The bigger picture here is that the West basically destroyed Libya. And they have to fix it. You break it, you fix it. When they removed Muammar Gaddafi, he was a dictator, yes, but Libya was stable. And so they have to work very hard to fix it. Now, it is this kind of hypocrisy that we are seeing now. The EU is pulling out, or reducing aid, security aid to Africa. The US, Trump is going to cut aid to security in Africa. Yet some of these problems are caused directly by their own policies. And that's where it's going to be rather difficult for the African heads of states and military security officials to try and deal with this. And I think we have to push the West a little bit more. They have to take responsibility for some of the problems that they have caused in Africa and around the world.
All right. All right, any of you want just to chime in on Libya very briefly? Then we go to North Korea and what is happening in North Korea with the nuke threat as well.
Yeah, the problem in Libya is not going to end very soon. At the moment, you have actually two governments in Libya. You have the government in the east, which is basically not recognized, and you have the government in Tripoli, which is the recognized government. Now, the international community is dealing with the government in Tripoli. But the other government, the one in Tripoli also has to deal with militias. And just the day before yesterday, they were able to dislodge a militia group from one of the airports and took control of that area. But that much said, Libya now needs to be fixed, and it doesn't only, it requires the West, because you remember the coalition forces who bombed Libya, the French, the British, the Americans, as well as the Italians. Now it's their business to fix Libya, because now much of the country apart from Tripoli and the eastern side of the country is ungovernable, and this has fed into what we've seen in Africa, the chaos in other sub-Saharan countries around Libya. And if the European Union wants to fix the migrant problem of the people going through Libya, then as a matter of fact, they must provide the necessary support to have a stable government in Libya, particularly the national government, and not the splinter government in the east of Libya.
All right. Okay, let's move on unless you want to chime in on, but I want us to focus also on North Korea and what is happening currently with the nuclear threat that is there. I had a story, but I think I can just read out what is actually there, because North Korea has also denounced U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's warning against them during his Asia trip, and said they are ready to war with the U.S. The North state-run television KRT on Tuesday cited its foreign ministry spokesman as saying North Korea have the will and capability to fully respond to any war which the U.S. wants. And of course, we've known some of the nuclear missiles that have actually been launched into the sea. Let's begin with you, Professor Nomidama, very briefly.
Let's look at Trump policy from a broader perspective in order to understand what is happening in North Korea. Number one is inward-looking is policy. Let's withdraw from the rest of the world and take care of this American situation. Secondly, is to reduce soft power and then focus on hard power. Cut the U.S. aid, to cut the State Department funding, which has been boosted from the Second World War to now.
But this cutting of the aid, we know North Korea has been under sanctions for the longest time ever.
Let me get there. Let me get there in a second. And thirdly, focus on bilateral instead of multilateral aid. Now, the U.S. policy from the Second World War to right now where we are is right the opposite of what Trump is trying to do. We all know that the closest the world came to thermonuclear war is over the Cuban Missile Crisis. We all understand the implication of what that was all about, both from the Soviet Union standpoint and from the American standpoint. What is happening in the Korean Peninsula is much more deadlier to the world than anything else you can think about. Number one, the North Korea is not acting alone. China has a lot of influence and a lot of incentive for North Korea that has built it to where it is right now. The young man in North Korea seems to be fairly unstable, and continuous threat, in terms of South Korea and Japan and everything else is going to bring the world catastrophe. It's going to bring the worst war that this world has ever seen since the Second World War.
Right,
and that's the reason the people are very cautious on approaching Trump, because he seems to be fairly irrational in looking at really the consequences of what can come.
Right, but pundits have been saying that, of course, the recent spate of launches that we've been seeing, the nuclear launches, is actually to test the temerity of Donald Trump, since he's newly installed as a president. They want to, check and see what will be his reaction. So what do you think his reaction has been so far, briefly?
Yeah, I like what you're saying, Debal, and it's part of what Professor is saying, but it is addressing what we call the theory of deterrence. And in deterrence theory, there's a scholar called Thomas Schelling, who was advising the US during the Vietnam War. And Schelling said, you better have a credible threat. Now, in deterrence theory, sometimes you find people who are doing what we call signaling. You want to signal your type and to demonstrate your resolve on a certain issue. And North Korea has been up to such games for a long time. But before you call the bluff or before you make the threat, you must be able, we say, to be able to have a threat that you can carry through. Otherwise, it can catapult badly on you. Now, in this context, what worries scholars, and Professor Midamba is right, is you don't fiddle around with, you can't fight a nuclear war the way we fight with conventional warfare. And therefore, there are two theories of nuclear warfare: substantial or instrumental, and existential. The fact that you have a nuke makes that you deter by having it. And some countries go with that. But you see, the North Koreans are going with the Maoist approach of the instrumentalists by saying, even if you throw 2 nukes at us, you can't finish all the China, and all that. Now, that is catastrophic, it's apocalyptic. So we have to be careful about it, and I think Leon Panetta is very careful, because he's saying, you've got to take these men seriously, these people seriously. Once they have nuclear capability and they can demonstrate it, you can only start talking to them.
But already we can see them spoiling for a war with the U.S.
The world is watching them. The International Atomic Agency is looking at them from the satellite. If they try to form a nuclear weapon to show that they have nuclear capacity, to bring up a nuclear machine, then they will have to face the music.
All right, let's hear from Captain Wadera.
Yeah, you see, to biggest extent in terms of the diplomatic issues that are on the table, North Korea has for a long time been considered the rogue nation. But as it were, it is in the Korean Peninsula, it has actually been acting at the behest of China. To the extent that you see China is already also causing ruckus around the region with Philippines and Japan over the islands in the South China Sea. So what North Korea is doing is simply adopting an offensive posture. And that offensive posture has of course drawn in, and in fact it wants to draw in, the US has passive deployment there. And they've just been around, they have fleets there. But what North Korea is doing is drawing them into the conflict. Now, you've already heard that Tillerson, the foreign secretary of the US, would rather skip NATO, the NATO meeting with the NATO foreign ministers, to meet with the president of China. Because what then has happened is that the South China Sea and the Korean Peninsula has become a much more important area in terms of geopolitics and international security than NATO. Now, looking at NATO, you also see what NATO has done. For the first time, the US is deploying 1,100 forces to Poland, across the border to Russia. That also NATO is adopting an offensive. It's no longer defensive in terms of defending their members. They're already saying we are becoming offensive by actively deploying combat forces in a country that is neighboring to their nemesis, Russia. At the same time, Tillerson will also be meeting with the Russian president later. In other words, what's happening in the world, there seems to be a realignment. And I agree with Professor Midaba that since Trump is irrational, there are only two options for the world here. China, on the other hand, is drawing attention to that area of conflict, Korean Peninsula, South China Sea. Now, Russia is also drawing attention to the eastern frontier between the European countries and its border. And you can see now that is drawing US attention from NATO. That means we've got a realignment. And the danger is, if North Korea, because again you have a situation where you have a very young leader who is highly excitable. If he is not controlled, then he would engage in what you call reckless military adventurism. And this is why the US Foreign Secretary would rather meet with the Chinese president, because China seems to have a lot of influence on North Korea.
Thank you. And Apollos Mashira, first of all, you can see the US, NATO is also not very sure about the U.S. commitment to NATO itself, because we've seen also Trump saying we'll cut, our alliances, that is including NATO as well. So, and we've seen, just as what we read earlier, that the NATO, the secretary also is at the Pentagon. He was at the Pentagon to actually make sure where are we standing at so far. He says, Donald Trump is not very, very, very sure as it is right now where he really stands when it comes to North Korea as well.
We have been trying to tame North Korea for a very long time. In fact, the Americans is trying to strengthen South Korea so that they can tame North Korea. Since North Korea has been, they have tried to tame it so much, they have also entrenched themselves into a hard position. So that is why they are so excitable, because I have seen that small president with his commander-in-chief crying when they throw a missile up. They cry and crap like babies. So you cannot trust that country. You cannot trust North Korea.
They literally cry.
They cry and jump and dance. So those are people you cannot trust in this world. So they must be tamed by everybody, including China. So Donald Trump should be a bit serious, and that's why that boy is saying he can throw a missile after a missile. You throw one, I throw two. You never know what he can do. So we should be careful.
Thank you.
With that country.
All right, let's hear from Dr. Mustafa.
Yeah, I think multilateralism is now taking a serious beating, especially with conservatives in England or Britain, in the United States of America, in China. And NATO is a multilateral institution. Trump sees that it's cheaper to engage bilaterally with China to engage bilaterally with Russia and try to you know, address the challenges that Russia would cause to America, the threats that Russia would, or rather the interests that might be compromised by Russia or China that are America's. When you are engaging multilaterally, you are engaging with, you know, with NATO is about 28 countries, and that becomes much more convoluted. And that Tillerson is keeping that particular meeting of NATO is telling how the US and the more powerful countries are going to engage in the coming years. And we've seen it very clearly that the US administration under Trump is now deriding the United Nations, another multilateral agency. And this is the way things seems to be panning and will be for the next 4 or 5 years.
Thank you.